Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into a figure who's, well, he's everywhere, from ancient carvings right up to modern blockbusters.
Mhm.
You provided us with a really fascinating stack of sources. There's a detailed Wikipedia entry and also a video transcript, all focused on one really central, powerful figure, the Norse god Thor.
That's right. And what's great about the material you've given us is how it traces him from those deep historical roots, how it was actually understood in Norse and Germanic paganism,
Yeah,
and then brings it right up to his presence today.
exactly. So our mission with this deep dive, drawing from these sources you sent, is to try and go beyond maybe what you see in movies and comics.
Sure. The pop culture version.
Right, and really uncover the, let's say, the true Norse hero. Was he primarily just a god of thunder, a cosmic protector, or,
Mhm.
is there maybe something more complex waiting in the ancient lore?
It's a great question because he is layered.
Yeah, we're excited to explore the many lives of this figure across history and myth, just as your sources present him.
Right. Absolutely. It really is fascinating to trace how a deity from, centuries ago still holds such power in our imagination today.
So let's start at the beginning, based on these sources. Who was Thor fundamentally in Norse mythology? What was his core identity?
Well, the sources really establish Thor as a hugely prominent god.
Okay.
Within the wider umbrella of Germanic paganism, yes, but most famously in Norse mythology.
Okay.
He's definitely the hammer-wielding deity we recognize, strongly associated with lightning, thunder, storms. That's clear.
The classic image.
But the sources are also clear he's more than just that. He's tied to sacred groves, trees, immense physical strength, and the protection of humankind. That's a major one.
Ah, okay, protection.
Yeah, and also things like hallowing, blessing things, and even fertility. So his portfolio, you could say, is much broader than just the weather.
Right, so he's deeply connected to the earth, human life, well-being. What about his family? The sources list some key relationships.
They do. He's the son of Odin, the chief god, and Yora, who is Earth herself.
No, fuck.
Yeah. And this parentage, it links him to both the divine, the sky father figure, and the physical, earthly realm, which scholars in your sources point out is pretty significant.
Interesting.
He's married to the golden-haired goddess Sif, but he also had a lover, the giantess Jarnsaxa.
Right.
And from these relationships, he's father to Truder, Magni, and Moidi. And he's also stepfather to the god Uller. So yeah, a full house.
It sounds like it. And his name, it seems to have this deep history popping up in different forms across languages.
Yes, absolutely. It traces back to the Proto-Germanic root hunaras, which basically just means thunder.
Simple enough.
Right. And you see this evolve across the Germanic languages. Sor in Old Norse, Thunder in Old English, Dinar in Old High German.
Ah.
The modern English Thor comes straight from that Old Norse form, Thor. It's a really clear line linked to his main association.
So the name itself tells a story.
It does. And your sources even touch on the Proto-Indo-European connection, suggesting maybe a shared ancient origin with thunder gods and other traditions like the Celtic Tyrannus or the Hindu god Indra.
Wow.
What's fascinating there is how these thunder deities often seem to play similar protective roles across different, really ancient cultures.
That shared root is amazing, thinking how old these ideas are. How do the sources describe his personality beyond just being strong?
Both sources, but
Oh.
especially the video transcript, paint a really vivid picture. Immense, almost terrifying strength, yes. Boundless energy.
Okay.
He's known for his directness, huge loyalty, unwavering dedication. He's often contrasted with Odin, right? Odin's the cunning one, maybe manipulative.
Right.
Thor is more straightforward, sometimes depicted as, well, maybe even a bit naive. That comes up in one myth. But despite his famous temper, the sources also show him with a deep sense of justice, compassion. He's really presented as the people's god, champion for humanity against chaos.
That contrast is compelling, the raw power, but also the loyalty to humanity. Okay, let's talk about the symbols of that power. His gear, his companions. You can't really think of Thor without Mjolnir.
Absolutely not. Mjolnir is like the cornerstone of his identity as a protector, a warrior. It's described as this legendary short-handled warhammer.
Short-handled, right?
Yeah. And your sources mentioned its creation by the dwarven smiths, Brakaur and Sindri, a story often linked to Loki's mischief, as usual.
Loki again.
Always Loki. But Mjolnir isn't just a weapon. Its properties, as detailed in the sources, are just extraordinary.
Like what?
Well, it never misses its target. It always returns to his hand, causes thunder and lightning, can smash mountains, crush giants.
Okay, standard god weapon stuff?
Sort of, but there's more. What's unique and quite insightful is its ability to hallow things, to bless them. And in one myth, it even brings the dead back to life.
Whoa.
Yeah. Which shows it's connected to fundamental forces beyond just destruction. It's about life and sanctity, too.
And the sources make a point about its weight.
They do. Incredibly heavy. So heavy that Thor actually needs special equipment to wield it properly.
Okay, so not just pure strength.
Exactly. That's where his iron gauntlets, Jarmgripra, come in. They let him grip the presumably very hot metal. And his belt, Mjolnir.
Mjolnir.
Yeah, it's said to double his already immense strength. He also owns a staff called Gri Arvular. These pieces of gear aren't just accessories. They're essential to his power.
So he's got these magical power-ups to fully use the hammer. What about how he gets around? His transport.
His famous ride. He travels in a chariot, or maybe a cart, pulled by two goats, Tangersnir and Tangjostra.
Goats, okay. Not horses.
Goats. And your sources mention this rather remarkable thing he can do with them.
Oh.
He can actually eat them for food when he's traveling.
Eat his own goats.
Yep, and then resurrect them the next day using Mjolnir to hallow their bones. As long as the bones aren't broken.
That is wild. And speaks again to Mjolnir's weird powers. Where does he live? Does he have a home base?
The sources mention 3 places, actually. Bilskirnir, Hrudiheimer, and Fruvangri, generally thought to be in Asgard, the realm of the gods.
Right. Okay, let's get to the action. Thor is central to so many famous Norse myths, mainly because of this role as protector, the giant slayer.
Definitely.
What are some key exploits the sources highlight?
Well, his defining role, as you said, is battling the Jotnar, the giants. They represent chaos, destruction, always threatening the cosmos.
Right.
And Thor's raw strength, his fury, it's often the only thing standing between them and, well, everyone else. Gods and humans.
And his most famous adversary has to be the serpent, right?
Undeniably, his ongoing rivalry with Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent. It was so huge he encircles the whole world.
Just massive.
Totally. And your sources describe famous clashes. There's the fishing trip story from the poem Hemisophilia.
Yeah, I remember reading about that one.
Thor uses an ox head as bait. Huge bait, hooks the serpent, pulls its head right out of the ocean onto the boat.
Can you imagine?
And strikes it with Mjolnir.
Yes.
Causes this huge cosmic commotion. Their encounters are legendary, and they're prophesied to meet one last time at Ragnarok.
The end of the world. The prophecy in Völuspá, mentioned in the Wikipedia source, it's pretty stark, isn't it? What happens?
Yeah, it is. At Ragnarok, Thor finally does slay the serpent. But he only manages to take 9 steps before he dies from the serpent's venom.
So they kill each other.
Basically, yes. It really highlights the immense ultimate cost of his protective role.
Wow. But not all his adventures are straightforward fights, are they? The sources mention the journey to Loki's fortress.
Ah, yes. That one's recounted in the Prose Edda. It's a fantastic story, but it's about trickery, illusions.
Right.
Thor gets completely deceived. He fails at tasks that seem simple, like lifting a cat.
Which wasn't a cat.
Exactly. It was actually Jormungandr in disguise. Or drinking from a horn.
Connected to the ocean.
Right. Or wrestling an old woman.
Who was old age itself.
Yep. It's a humbling experience for him.
And Loki even throws this back in his face later, doesn't he? In the Lycosena poem, referencing Thor crouching in fear in the thumb of a glove, which was another illusion.
Exactly. That myth, referenced across different sources, it's really insightful. It shows his raw power, sure, but also his, let's say, occasional susceptibility to cleverness, to magic, and how even the other gods saw that side of him.
It kind of humanizes him a bit, maybe, paradoxically. He also has that famously unusual adventure to get Mjolnir back.
Oh, that story from Hrimsvieta. Yes. His hammer gets stolen by the giant Freymys.
Okay.
And Frymir demands the goddess Freyja as his bride in return.
Which she's not having.
Definitely not. So the gods cook up this wild plan. Disguise Thor as Freyja.
Thor in a dress.
Thor in a wedding dress. With Loki accompanying him as his bridesmaid.
Oh, man.
Your sources detail the humor and absurdity. Thor's barely contained rage, his massive appetite at the wedding feast, eating whole oxen, drinking barrels of mead.
Not very ladylike.
Not at all. His terrifying eyes when Chariots lifts the veil, and then the climax. He gets Mjolnir back in his lap and just unleashes. Kills Hrymr, kills all the other giants there.
It's brutal.
It's this unique blend of comedy, suspense, and then just absolute brutal violence. Shows a very different side of him compared to the noble protector image sometimes.
It's certainly memorable. There's also a verbal duel mentioned, a flighting.
Yes, Harbor Way. It recounts this flighting, basically a contest of insults, between Thor and Odin, who's disguised as a ferryman named Harbarar.
Odin in disguise again?
Seems to be his thing. And through their insults and boasts, we actually learn more details about Thor's travels, his giant killing exploits. But it also contrasts his directness with Odin's more, cryptic nature.
And there's Alvismal, too.
Right, the story where he outwits a dwarf.
How does he manage that? He's not usually the cunning one.
Well, it's less cunning, more stalling. This wise dwarf, Alvis, wants to marry Thor's daughter. Thor doesn't like this.
Understood.
So he delays the dwarf by challenging him to answer riddles about the names of things in different worlds all through the night. He just keeps him talking and talking. Until sunrise, at which point the dwarf turns to stone, because dwarves can't be in sunlight.
Ha! Clever in its own way.
It is. Using knowledge, or rather forcing the dwarf to display knowledge as a weapon to protect his family.
Okay, so moving beyond the myths themselves, how do the sources show Thor appearing in the actual historical record, outside of the poems and stories?
Right. This is where it gets really interesting, connecting the myth to actual history. Your sources point to early encounters recorded by the Romans. They practiced something called interpretatio Romana.
What's that?
It's basically where the Romans identified foreign gods with figures in their own pantheon based on similarities they saw.
Ah, okay.
So they saw Thor, this powerful thunder god, and they linked him to Hercules because of the strength, or sometimes Jupiter because of the thunder and sky aspect. Tacitus, writing way back in the late 1st century, mentions a Germanic tribe, the Suebi, worshipping Hercules in a sacred wood. Scholars generally interpret that Hercules as being Thor, or his earlier Germanic equivalent.
So the Romans were seeing parallels centuries before our main Viking Age sources were even written down.
Exactly. And then we see scattered mentions popping up later. The earliest recorded Germanic name, sonar, appears on a piece of jewelry from the migration period in Bavaria.
Wow.
In Old English texts, you find thunder mentioned, sometimes used to explain the Roman god Jupiter. There's that phrase sonarad, the thunder ride, maybe referring to his chariot.
Right, the goat chariot.
Potentially. And significantly, the Old Saxon baptismal vow from the 9th century. It explicitly lists Thunor among the gods that Christian converts had to renounce.
Showing he was a major figure they needed to reject.
Precisely. And of course, there's the famous story of St. Boniface felling Donar's oak in Germany in the 8th century, a direct symbolic clash between Christianity and the worship of Thor Donor.
So all these different linguistic traces, historical accounts, they start to build a picture of worship across various Germanic groups. And the Viking Age itself seems to be his peak popularity.
Without a doubt. Adam of Bremen's account of the great pagan temple at Uppsala in Sweden from the 11th century is absolutely key here.
What did he describe?
He describes Thor's statue as the mightiest god there, seated on a throne in the middle, governing the sky, weather, crops, fertility. He details sacrifices made specifically to Thor during times of plague or famine.
Wow, for basic survival needs.
Exactly, highlighting his importance for just fundamental human well-being. And the fact that a man named Wolfred was reportedly lynched there for supposedly profaning Thor's image, it underscores just how central and revered he must have been.
And archaeology really brings that prominence to life too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Your sources point to just a wealth of archaeological evidence, especially from the Viking Age. We find runic inscriptions all across Scandinavia invoking Thor, often using the phrase, "May Thor hallow," or "May Thor protect."
So calling on his protective power in everyday life.
Yes. And then there are the hammer pendants. Over 1,000 have been found across various regions. Little Mjolnir replicas people wore.
They look so much like a direct parallel to Christian crosses appearing around the same time.
Many scholars, drawing from the sources you've provided, interpret them exactly that way. A conscious heathen response, maybe. A symbol of allegiance to the old ways, and specifically to Thor as the great protector in the face of this new religion.
Interesting.
We also find coins stamped with hammers, and even some statues, like the Ireland statue from Iceland, which might depict him holding Mjolnir.
And the swastika symbol, the sources mention that too.
Yes, historically in this context, the swastika symbol is identified with Thor's hammer or maybe lightning. It appears on objects from much earlier periods right through the Viking Age. It was seen as protective, linked to light and fire.
So his presence is felt in text, in objects, and even in people's names.
Yes, that's another fascinating point from the sources. The frequency of personal names containing shore, like Horstein or Sorkel, increased significantly during the Viking Age.
Why is that?
Well, The interpretation is that it might have been a form of cultural assertion, maybe even defiance against Christianization. Like wearing the hammer pendants, naming your child after Thor was a statement.
A way of holding on to identity.
Possibly. And of course, his name is literally embedded in our week. Your sources explain how Thursday comes directly from Thor's day, Horstagr in Old Norse,
Right.
which itself was a direct translation, a calque of the Latin day of Jove, Iovis dies. So the Romans and later Germanic peoples basically mapped their chief sky and thunder gods onto the same day of the week.
That's a fantastic example of how deeply ingrained he still is, even if we don't think about it. Did his influence just vanish after Christianization became widespread?
Not entirely, no. Your sources show these lingering traces. There's a runic inscription from Briggen in Norway, dated to the 12th century, well after official conversion, that still invokes Thor alongside Odin.
Still calling on him?
Seems so. And interestingly, elements of his character seem to have been sort of absorbed into folk traditions surrounding St. Olaf in Norway.
St. Olaf, the Christian king.
The very one. But in folklore, he's often depicted with Thor-like qualities. Immense strength, a quick temper, being a slayer of monsters, like trolls.
Trolls being like the descendants of giants in folklore.
Exactly. And later depictions even gave St. Olaf a red beard.
Ah, the red beard. It's so iconic now, especially in folklore, but the sources say the earliest myths don't actually mention his beard color.
That's right. The red beard seems to be a later, particularly Scandinavian folk tradition,
Right.
but it became strongly associated with him. Folk traditions and phrases survived into modern Germanic languages, too.
Like what?
Things like Danish rhymes mentioning Thor with his long beard, or North Frisian curses linked to red-haired thunder. Many words for thunder or lightning in Scandinavian languages actually derive from or are euphemisms for his name. Like the Swedish Tordun, which means Thor's rumble, or Oska, which might mean the god's ride, linking back to the chariot.
Huh.
The belief that lightning scares away trolls is also seen as a late reflection of his giant slaying role. And the sources point to everyday things named after him, like wedge-shaped stones found in fields called Thorwigger, Thor's wedges.
People thought they were his thunderbolts.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Or a beetle called Thorbag, which later got a more sinister name, Thordevil, after Christianization.
It's amazing how these fragments survived in folklore. And scholars looking at all this, they've offered various interpretations of Thor, too.
Yes, drawing from all these sources we've been discussing, Georgiou Mazil, the comparative mythologist, saw him representing the function of strength, though maybe sometimes secondary to Odin's function of sovereignty and magic.
Okay.
His strong association with fertility, bringing the rain needed for crops, his marriage to Sif, with her golden hair representing grain that's undeniable, too.
Right, fertility was mentioned early on.
But perhaps most significantly, and this comes up again and again in your sources, is his connection to humanity, to everyday concerns, protecting homes, families, communities, fields. He's the god people turn to for immediate protection against threats, whether cosmic giants or, just bad weather.
That connection to protection and strength, it brings us right up to the modern era, doesn't it?
Absolutely. He's had this massive resurgence in modern culture. Beyond mythology itself, we see his name pop up in, science, the element thorium.
Right.
Military technology like the Thor missile. Even nature, there's an animal called Thor's hero shrew, apparently named for its incredible structural strength.
Okay, and of course, pop culture.
Undoubtedly.
Yeah.
Marvel's Thor is probably the most widely recognized version today, though your sources correctly point out the comic book version often looks quite different from the later folk depiction, that usually clean-shaven and blonde, not the red-haired, bearded figure from folklore.
Yeah, that's true.
But he's a core Avenger, a huge cinematic presence. He appears across media in Neil Gaiman's books like American Gods, Rick Riordan's Magnus Chase series for younger readers, the Netflix show Ragnarok, major video games like God of War, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Smite.
He's everywhere.
It really is. His figure is constantly being reinterpreted, but often returning to that core idea of a mighty protector against overwhelming odds.
So looking back at everything these sources have presented, from the earliest historical traces, ancient myths, his survival in folklore, right up to modern comics and movies.
Yeah.
Why do you think Thor specifically this god, has endured so strongly? What is it about him that just resonates so deeply with people across centuries and cultures?
That's the big question, isn't it? And I think your sources actually provide a pretty clear answer if you piece it together. It's his relatability as a protector.
How so?
Well, unlike Odin, who can be quite elusive, mysterious, maybe even manipulative, Thor is direct. He's powerful, yes, but he's fiercely loyal, especially to the vulnerable, to humankind. His strength against these immense cosmic threats, the giants, the world serpent, that's fundamentally appealing, isn't it? He embodies that raw power you need to defend against chaos. And that's a timeless human concern.
Definitely.
And maybe his flaws, his famous temper, his straightforwardness, sometimes bordering on naive, they paradoxically make him feel more grounded, more accessible perhaps than some other deities. He feels like the champion you could actually call on when things get really tough.
Yeah, I can see that. It really does feel like he represents that fundamental need for a strong defense against overwhelming forces, something solid. We've covered so much ground here.
We really have.
From the ancient thunder deity and protector through all those complex mythological adventures, his lasting presence in language, archaeology, and then his reinterpretation in modern culture.
It's been quite a deep dive into the material you provided, yeah.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. Given the sheer variety of ways Thor has been depicted and interpreted over time, I mean, from ancient myths focusing on fertility and protecting humans, to later folklore emphasizing his red beard and battle against trolls, and then right up to modern comics where he's often a blonde superhero. What does the figure of Thor tell you about our human need for heroes, and maybe how our idea of what a protector looks like changes or perhaps stays fundamentally the same across the ages?